It was supposed to be a simple shift, just a regular, boring night at the restaurant where I worked for my friend's parents. But that night, something went off kilter, like a single misplaced note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. I was waiting for the clock to tick past the end of my shift so I could drag myself home, but instead, I found myself handed a delivery that seemed to stretch across the entire map of dread. It was one of those bone-chilling September evenings when the air feels thin and brittle, the kind that makes the light seem to bleed out of the sky a bit too early. I was ready to clock out and escape, but then came the assignment one last delivery. The manager, who never looked at me unless it was to bark out orders, slid the ticket across the counter without a word. I glanced at it and felt the uneasy prickle of foreboding. The address was miles away, deeper into the countryside than I'd ever gone during my shifts. It wasn't just the distance that set my nerves on edge, it was the nature of the delivery. The destination was a place that looked like it had been exiled from a time long past. An old house that sagged like a tired old man, its paint peeling in ribbons, and its windows dark, hollow eyes watching me as I approached. I parked on the gravel driveway, the crunch of stones under my tires sounding louder than usual. I could feel the night closing in around me, the shadows lengthening and wrapping themselves around the house. The dim porch light flickered weakly, as if it were trying to ward off something far darker. When I rang the doorbell, it let out a rusty, mournful chime that seemed to echo through the empty hallways inside. I waited, the seconds stretching and contracting like they were caught in some nightmarish time warp. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a young man who looked as though he'd just stepped out of a Gothic novel, pale, gaunt, eyes too wide and too dark. "Leave the food on the porch," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an unsettling chill. There was something about his eyes, the way they darted around like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to leave the food and run, but I forced myself to smile and nod. "Sure thing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I placed the bag of food on the porch, every creak of the wooden planks beneath me feeling like the groan of a beast waking from slumber. I glanced back at the young man, whose eyes were now fixed on the food with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait for a thank you or any sign of acknowledgement. I turned on my heel and practically flew back to my car, my heart hammering like a war drum in my chest. The drive back was a blur, my thoughts tangled in a web of unease. The house, with its sagging eaves and ghostly windows, stayed in my mind, like a photograph that refused to fade. The next day, I went into work and handed in my resignation. The restaurant had lost its charm, its dimly lit corners now seeming more like the shadows of nightmares than the sanctuary they once were. My friend's parents looked at me with a mix of confusion and irritation, but I couldn't bring myself to explain why I'd had enough. The unspoken terror of that night was something I couldn't fully articulate, not even to myself. I left the job, but the image of that old house remained with me, a permanent stain on my memories. I would lie awake some nights, imagining that young man standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me with that unnerving stare. The house was always there in my dreams, a dark silhouette against a backdrop of despair. Every so often, I would hear stories about that part of town, whispers of strange occurrences, disappearances, and unexplained events. I tried to brush them off, to convince myself that it was just my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some places are never meant to be visited, and some deliveries should never be made. That night, I realized that some doors are better left unopened, and some addresses should remain forever unvisited. I'm not one to get spooked easily. After all, I spend my nights navigating the darkest corners of the city, dropping off orders and skirting past alleyways where even the stray cats seem to keep their distance. But the night I delivered to that house, well, that was different. That night I felt the weight of something sinister hanging in the air, and it clung to me long after I drove away. It started like any other night, slightly chilly, the kind of evening that makes you wish you'd worn a jacket. I was on my way to drop off a late-night order of burgers and fries. The address was in a part of town I don't usually frequent, quiet, desolate. The houses seemed like they had long given up on ever seeing life again. But Postmates had a job for me, and I wasn't one to question it. When I pulled up to the house, I could barely make out the details through the darkness. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The lawn was overgrown, with weeds that seemed to reach out and scratch at my tires. The paint on the walls was peeling away like old skin, and the windows were clouded with grime. The only sign of life was a flickering porch light that gave off just enough illumination to make things even creepier. I grabbed the food and approached the front door, which creaked open before I even had a chance to knock. Inside, a woman stood in the entryway. Her appearance was disheveled, her hair a tangled mess that framed her gaunt face. Her eyes were wide, as if she hadn't seen a visitor in ages, or perhaps she hadn't seen one because she didn't want to. "Here's your food," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't say a word. She just reached out with a trembling hand to take the bags, her fingers brushing against mine in a way that made my skin crawl. As I turned to leave, I noticed a man watching me from the side of the house. He was partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes glinted in the darkness, and I could feel his gaze tracking my every move. There was something unsettling about his stillness, as if he was waiting for something, a sign, a signal. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and headed back to my car. That's when things took a turn for the worse. My car, an old but reliable sedan, had always been my fortress of solitude, but tonight it was anything but. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed a bent metal pipe wrapped around my front wheel. It wasn't just any pipe, it looked like a makeshift wheel lock, a crude attempt to keep me from driving away. Panic surged through me. I yanked at the pipe, but it was wedged tight. My heart pounded as I looked back at the house. The woman had disappeared from view, and the man was now standing in the front yard, still watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I scrambled to call for help, but my phone seemed to have decided this was the perfect time to die. It was a miracle I had my backup battery pack with me. I managed to get a call through to the police, my voice cracking with fear as I tried to explain the situation. They promised to send someone right away, but time seemed to stretch and bend, each second feeling like an eternity. While I waited, I kept glancing at the house, half expecting to see those dark figures moving closer, closing in on me. My skin was crawling, every sound amplified by my nerves: the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of a dog, the steady thud of my own heartbeat. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, a car's headlights pierced through the darkness. It was the police. Relief flooded through me as they got out and inspected the scene. They found the pipe and removed it, but when they went to search the house, it was empty. No sign of the woman, no trace of the man. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The police couldn't find anything that would lead them to the perpetrators. No records, no prior complaints. It was as if I had stumbled into a nightmare that had no real substance, something meant to frighten and confuse rather than to be understood. I drove away from that place with my hands shaking on the wheel and the creeping feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than a mere wheel lock. The memory of those cold, unblinking eyes and the shadowy figures at the edge of the house haunted me long after I left. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. It's been a few weeks since that delivery, and I haven't been back to that part of town. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark figures watching me from the shadows. I know it sounds crazy, but there are nights when I feel like the darkness is still following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a night painted with the brushstrokes of late summer, a night where shadows stretched long and the air carried a promise of chill. I was alone in the house, the kind of solitude that makes the ticking of the clock seem louder, the creaking of the floorboards more pronounced. I was 17, not quite a child but not yet an adult, and the stillness of the house felt like a companion I couldn't quite trust. The doorbell rang just as I settled onto the couch, ready for a night of mindless TV. I glanced at the clock. Midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door, the old wooden floorboards groaning under my feet. Through the peephole, I saw her, an older woman, her face framed by wild gray hair and eyes that glinted with an unsettling light. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see her properly. "Yes," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hello, dear, I'm so sorry to trouble you, but I'm in desperate need of a phone. My car broke down, and my cell isn't working." Her voice was soft, but there was something off about it, like an old record, slightly scratched and out of tune. I hesitated. There was a sharpness to her demeanor, a certain frantic energy that set off alarm bells in my mind. "I'm not sure if I can help," I began, my fingers itching to close the door. Before I could shut it, she pressed a hand against the frame. "Please," she said, her eyes widening in a way that made me shiver. "Just let me use your phone for a moment. I'll be quick, I promise." Something about her insistence, the way she looked through the crack in the door, as if trying to peer into my very soul, made me shudder. I shook my head and managed a weak, "I'm sorry, but it's really late. I can't help you." I shut the door and bolted the lock, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. I tried to shake off the encounter as I returned to the couch, but the unsettling feeling gnawed at me. Then, a noise. A light tapping at the window. I froze, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I moved cautiously toward the window, hoping to find nothing more than a branch tapping against the glass. But no, there she was, standing in the dim glow of the streetlight, her face illuminated in a ghastly, sickly light. Her eyes met mine, and she gave a strange, half-smile. I felt the air grow colder, the room shrinking around me. I backed away, my heart in my throat. I could see her from the corner of my eye, still standing there, tapping with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Suddenly, headlights pierced through the room, and I saw a car pull up in front of the house. A man stepped out tall, with an angular face that was hard to discern in the darkness. He moved with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the house, and then the yard. My pulse quickened as I realized he was searching the backyard. The woman was still at the window, her tapping relentless. The man's silhouette moved around the house, his flashlight sweeping across the yard. My anxiety turned to dread as the realization hit me they were both still outside. They were searching, looking, and I was alone in the house, trapped. I thought about calling the police, but a wave of paralyzing fear stopped me. What if they heard me? What if they came inside? My mind raced with terrifying scenarios, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. I waited in the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The man's footsteps grew louder, closer, until he was almost at the door. I held my breath, praying for him to leave, for the night to return to its previous mundane silence. The woman's tapping stopped abruptly. I heard her move away from the window, and the car's engine roared to life. The man appeared to give up his search and got into the car, which drove off into the night. I stood there, trembling, my mind still whirling. When the house was finally quiet again, I crept to the window and peeked outside. The yard was empty, the street was still, but the night had changed. The silence was heavy with the weight of something unsaid, something unseen. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up listening to every creak and groan of the house, every whisper of the wind. The woman's face, her tapping, and the man's search were etched into my mind, haunting me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun rose without fanfare, casting its indifferent light on the world. But I knew that the night had revealed something dark and unknown that lurked just out of sight. The memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkness outside the window isn't as frightening as the darkness within our own minds. I learned that fear can be as tangible as a shadow, and that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones who come knocking at our door. I remember the first time I encountered true fear. It wasn't in some shadowy alley or a deserted building, but in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, my friend's house. I was house-sitting for a few days while they were away on vacation. It was supposed to be a relaxing gig, take care of the plants, feed the cat, and enjoy the quiet solitude. But it turned into something much darker, something that haunts me to this day. The house was one of those old colonial beauties with creaky floors and grand, silent rooms that seemed to hold their breath. The kind of place where every shadow stretches long and sinister, and every creak of the floorboard sounds like the whisper of an old ghost. I had always liked it, its antique charm, and the cozy feel it gave, but that week, the house revealed a different side. It started on the first night. I was lounging on the sofa, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the room, when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft, almost imperceptible noise, a whisper, maybe, or a sigh. I dismissed it as the house settling or the wind rustling through the trees outside. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew more persistent. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the house, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I wandered through the rooms, each step echoing in the emptiness. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, which hadn't ticked since I arrived, now seemed to be moving on its own. The pendulum swung back and forth with a steady, rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I tried to ignore it, retreating to the kitchen to make dinner. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could almost sense eyes on me, though I was alone. The hair on my arm stood on end, and every shadow seemed to dance with a life of its own. I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves and the unfamiliarity of being alone in a strange house. That night, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cat, usually aloof, was acting strangely. It hissed at corners of the room where nothing was visible, its fur bristling as if it saw something I couldn't. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder as I tried to drown them out with the sound of the TV. When I finally turned off the lights and lay down, the whispers reached a crescendo. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a cacophony of soft, indecipherable murmurs that filled the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the fear clawed at me, making it hard to breathe. In the dead of night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and echoed through the empty house. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps grew closer, and I could feel a presence moving just outside my bedroom door. I wanted to get up, to investigate, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so primal it left me gasping. When the footsteps stopped, I waited, holding my breath. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I waited until dawn, the whispers and footsteps retreating with the first light of day. But the fear remained, lingering like a shadow. When my friends finally returned, I was relieved but unsettled. I never told them the full story, not wanting to sound like a fool or scare them off. But the experience had left me changed. I had seen firsthand that a house can be more than just bricks and mortar. It can be a living, breathing entity with secrets of its own. The house that whispered had taught me a lesson in fear. one that stayed with me long after I left. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters under the bed or the ghosts in the attic, but the quiet, creeping feeling that something unseen is watching, waiting. It's funny how a place you think is safe can turn into a nightmare, how the familiar can become terrifying. It makes you wonder what other dark secrets lie behind the walls of the places we call home. Sometimes, it's not the haunted house we need to fear, but the whispers that come from within. So when you find yourself alone in a quiet house, remember the scariest horrors are not always the ones that jump out at you, but the ones that linger, unseen, in the dark corners of your mind. And if you find yourself haunted by those whispers, well, maybe it's time to listen a little closer. You might not like what you hear. I had been living on my own for years, relishing the solitude and the predictable rhythm of my life. That was until Luke moved in. He answered the ad for the spare room in my apartment, and I was in a pinch, so I agreed. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. Luke was the sort of person who gave you the chills before you even knew what chills were. From the moment he stepped through the door, there was something about him that set me on edge. It wasn't just the way he kept to himself, or the fact that he spoke in a whisper like he was afraid of disturbing some unseen presence. It was everything combined: his piercing eyes, his strange mannerisms, and those inexplicable, tight-lipped smiles he flashed from time to time. His arrival was marked by a set of peculiar rules that seemed to govern his existence. No loud noises after dark, no sudden movements, and never, under any circumstances, should one enter his room without explicit permission. It wasn't so much a list of house rules as it was a list of demands, each one delivered in that soft, unsettling voice of his. I tried to comply, not wanting to rock the boat with my new roommate, but every time he spoke, I felt the creeping sensation that something was not quite right. The first sign of trouble was subtle. Luke's absence was a regular occurrence, almost as if he had a second life I knew nothing about. He'd leave the apartment at odd hours, always dressed in those dark, heavy clothes that seemed to swallow light. Each time he returned, his eyes held a hollowed, vacant stare, as if he had seen something that had scarred him permanently. I tried to ignore the nagging unease that gnawed at me, but then things began to happen. Small things at first, like the door to his room being left ajar when it should have been locked tight. I told myself it was just Luke's absent-mindedness, or perhaps his deliberate attempt at testing my adherence to his rules. Yet the door was never just ajar. It was always slightly open, as though inviting me to look inside, just a peek, but never quite letting me do so. Then, the noises began. I'd lie awake at night, the quiet of my room disrupted by the faintest sounds: shuffling, scraping, the occasional clink of something heavy being dropped. Each noise seemed to come from Luke's room, always just at the edge of my hearing, like a whisper in the wind that I couldn't quite place. I'd get up to investigate, but every time I reached his door, the noises would cease, leaving me standing in the hall, heart racing, my skin prickling with cold sweat. The real turning point came when I noticed that my personal items, books, papers, even the occasional piece of clothing had been moved. It was as if someone had been in my room, shuffling through my things, leaving a trail of silent invasion. I confronted Luke about it one evening, his response a mask of calm that barely hid the irritation behind his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice smooth and level. "I don't touch your stuff. I have my own things to worry about," but the way he said it, so detached and clinical, only served to increase my unease. I began to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether I was imagining the disturbances. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the apartment grew increasingly suffocating. The once comforting walls now seemed to close in around me, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, magnifying the feeling of dread. Luke's behavior grew even more erratic. He'd sometimes come home with strange, dark stains on his clothes, and his eyes, oh, his eyes always darting to some unseen threat. One night, after a particularly disturbing episode of scraping and thudding from his room, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I waited until Luke left for one of his mysterious absences, then I carefully turned the handle of his door. The lock clicked open, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was shrouded in darkness, the curtains drawn tight. My eyes struggled to adjust as I took in the room's contents. It was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a dresser, and a few nondescript boxes stacked haphazardly. But what caught my eye was the strange collection of items scattered across the floor: twisted bits of metal, a couple of grimy old books, and a stack of photographs, some of which were unmistakably of me. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped through the photographs, each one showing me in various states of vulnerability, taken from angles that suggested someone had been watching me for a long time. I felt a surge of panic as I realized the true extent of Luke's invasion, the sickening knowledge that he had been monitoring me, stalking me in my own home. I fled from the room, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing. I had to get out, had to escape from this nightmare. I packed a bag quickly, my movements frantic, and I left the apartment, not daring to look back. I spent the night at a friend's place, unable to shake the feeling of Luke's presence lingering just behind me, a shadow that never quite left. I never went back to that apartment. The landlord was informed of the situation and the police were called, but by then Luke had vanished. He left no trace behind, no hint of where he might have gone. The apartment was cleaned out, all his belongings gone, leaving me with nothing but the chilling memory of what had transpired. To this day, I still feel the echo of that fear, the knowledge that someone had been living in the shadows of my life, observing me with a cold, detached curiosity. The apartment was just a place, but Luke's presence, the unease he instilled, the fear he left behind lingers like a ghost, a reminder that sometimes the monsters we face are not from the darkness outside, but from the shadows within. The first inkling that something was wrong came as a chill down my spine, a sensation so sudden and uninvited that it made my skin crawl. I had been out all day, running errands and dealing with the mundane minutiae of life, only to come home and feel, inexplicably, that something had shifted. It was a gut feeling, the kind that's so insidious it worms its way into your thoughts and makes everything seem off kilter. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to stress or fatigue. The sense of unease was compounded when I stumbled upon the small, almost imperceptible sign of intrusion. My bedroom window was slightly ajar. It had been shut tight when I left. I knew that for a fact because I had double-checked it before stepping out. I remember it vividly, the click of the latch falling into place, a sound so satisfying and final it was impossible to ignore. And yet, here it was, open just a crack. Pushing aside the growing sense of dread, I told myself that perhaps a breeze had nudged it open. But as I pushed open the door to my room, the suffocating silence was replaced by a creeping sense of paranoia. The room was just as I had left it, neat, almost sterile, with everything in its place. Everything, that is, except for one thing. Luke was in my room. I had known Luke for years. He was a friend, a seemingly dependable one. But standing there in the doorway, my brain struggled to reconcile the image of my friend with the intruder standing in my room, his face partially hidden in the shadows. His back was to me, and he seemed to be rifling through my belongings. The unease that had been a faint whisper suddenly roared into a cacophony of panic. "Luke," I managed to croak out, the sound coming out of my mouth like a ragged whisper. He froze, and for a moment, time itself seemed to hang in the balance. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, charged with something beyond the realm of physical presence. He turned slowly, as if dragging his movements through thick molasses. His face, pale and strangely expressionless, was lit by the faint glow of the lamp on my nightstand. There was a moment of utter silence, a suspended beat where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, Luke's eyes met mine, and the reality of the situation crashed down on me with all the force of a sledgehammer. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke's response was almost mechanical, a practiced performance that seemed disconcertingly calm. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon. I was just looking for something." His words fell flat, lacking any semblance of genuine emotion. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Looking for what?" He shrugged, the gesture too casual for the gravity of the situation. "Just stuff. Things I left behind." I stared at him, trying to process the implications of what I was seeing. He had no business being in my room, rifling through my things. I felt a surge of anger and fear coiling in my gut, a sickening mix that made me want to scream and flee all at once. The sense of betrayal was palpable, thickening the air around us. "Luke, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to leave." Now I tried to keep my voice steady, but it trembled with the weight of my rising panic. He blinked, as if my words were trying to penetrate a fog. "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No," I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "You have no right to be here. Get out." There was a brief flash of something: guilt? Defiance? Crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He turned and walked past me, not meeting my gaze. The air was still heavy, like it had absorbed the tension between us and was reluctant to let it go. I stood there, rooted to the spot, until I heard the front door slam behind him. The sudden silence was deafening, and the room felt like it had just been vacuumed of all life and warmth. The sight of my disheveled bed, my belongings scattered and rifled through, was more than I could bear. I didn't waste time. I grabbed a few essentials, my heart racing with the urgency of someone fleeing a disaster. The thought of Luke, somewhere out there, lingering with knowledge of my private space, made my skin crawl. As I locked the door behind me and drove away, my mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and invasion. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a place that had once been a sanctuary now tainted by the presence of someone who had violated its very essence. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my room, those dark corners where my belongings used to be neatly arranged, seemed to shift and writhe with every creak of the house. Every sound, every breeze felt like a reminder of that awful intrusion. I could still see Luke's face, pale and unreadable, his eyes devoid of the warmth I once knew. The image of him rifling through my belongings, the knowing glance he shot me as if to say he was beyond reproach, was burned into my memory. I realized that the breach of privacy was more than just a physical invasion, it was an emotional violation that would leave scars long after the physical traces had disappeared. The darkness of my room felt deeper now, the walls closing in with a suffocating weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that Luke's intrusion had opened a door to something far more disturbing than a simple breach of trust. It was as if the very fabric of my sanctuary had been torn, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. As dawn broke, the light did nothing to dispel the darkness that had settled in my mind. The room, my sanctuary, would never be the same. And Luke? He had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of his betrayal and the cold, lingering fear that he or something darker might be watching from just beyond the shadows. I don't like to admit it, but sometimes the deliveries you make have a way of chasing you down. It was one of those nights, a creeping kind of cold that seemed to seep through my bones no matter how many layers I wore. The grocery store was a black monolith against the void of the evening sky, its once bright sign now faded and lifeless. It was supposed to be an ordinary delivery, but nothing about it felt ordinary. The request had come in late. It was unusual in itself, a single address, a place I'd never heard of, with a stipulation that the delivery be made after hours. The customer had been vague on the phone, the kind of vague that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. "Just bring it around the back," they'd said, voice muffled, as if speaking through a tunnel. "I'll meet you there." It wasn't uncommon for stores to close early, but this one was different. The parking lot was a ghost town, littered with old, forgotten shopping carts, their wheels rusted into place. I parked my van by the back entrance, the dim light from a single flickering bulb casting eerie shadows against the peeling brick. I could hear the low hum of the streetlights, the only sound in the otherwise dead night. A sense of unease prickled at my spine as I grabbed the delivery from the back of my van. The night was thick, almost tangible, and the silence was so complete it felt like it was pressing in on me. My flashlight bobbed in front of me, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The customer was waiting as promised, though he was hardly what I'd expected. Dressed in a threadbare coat and hat pulled low over his eyes, he looked more like a spectral figure than a man. He approached me with a hesitant shuffle, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was measuring every step. "Over here," he said, motioning towards a door at the far end of the alley. I could barely make out the door's outline in the darkness, and something about it seemed off, like it didn't quite belong. I was about to ask for some identification when I noticed a second figure emerging from the shadows. He was dressed similarly, his face hidden beneath a brimmed hat. My pulse quickened. It felt like a scene from a bad horror movie, one of those where you know you should turn back, but curiosity or stubbornness makes you press on. Just as I was about to voice my concerns, the door creaked open, and the second man stepped closer to me, his hand reaching out, fingers twitching in the dim light. My instincts screamed at me danger, danger, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the creeping dread that seemed to settle in my chest. "Wait," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on here?" Before I could react, the second man lunged at me, but I was faster. I slammed the van's door shut and jumped into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I threw the van into gear and tore out of the parking lot, glancing back just in time to see the two figures fading into the distance. I sped down the road, adrenaline making my hands shake as I gripped the wheel. It wasn't until I was a good distance away that I finally pulled over, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911, but the response was dishearteningly bland. The operator's voice was a monotone drone, offering no solace or urgency. "You'll need to contact the local precinct for further assistance," she said. "We have no record of any immediate danger in that area." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was I really supposed to believe that two men trying to jump me in a deserted alley was just an everyday occurrence? And what about the missing delivery driver I'd heard about on the news, a driver who had vanished under circumstances eerily similar to my own encounter? My mind raced as I made my way home, the events of the night replaying like a looped film. It wasn't until I got there that I realized the weight of what had happened. I had narrowly escaped something dark and sinister that had lingered just beyond the edge of the light. As I lay in bed, the darkness of the room pressing in on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed paths with something more than just a pair of would-be thieves. The fear I felt was raw and primal, a gnawing realization that I had brushed against the unknown. In the days that followed, the grocery store's name faded from memory, but the fear remained. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone or something was watching me. And every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see those shadowy figures lurking, waiting for another chance to draw me into their dark, silent world. The Royal Caribbean cruise was supposed to be a glorious escape from the monotony of my life. Instead, it turned out to be a journey into a darkness I wasn't prepared for. The sun had just begun its slow descent over the Atlantic when the ship's engines roared with their steady hum, promising another quiet night at sea. I was behind the bar, polishing glasses and trying to keep myself awake with the monotony of routine when Sebastian first walked in. He was one of those men who seemed to have come from a different era, tall, with a slightly disheveled suit that spoke of once wealthy days now past. His hair was silver, more from weariness than age. I noticed him immediately. There was something magnetic about his presence, though not in a way that made you feel comfortable. Sebastian took a seat at the bar, his eyes scanning the room with an almost anxious intensity. He didn't speak much at first, just sipped his drink, something dark and rich that smelled faintly of oak. I tried to keep it light, offering him small talk about the ship, the weather, the upcoming ports. But he wasn't having it. After a while, he opened up. It was a story as old as time, but told with such raw emotion it felt like a fresh wound. He told me about his wife, the infidelity, the constant turmoil that had become the soundtrack of his life. His voice cracked as he described how everything he once held dear had slowly disintegrated into nothingness. It was the kind of story that makes you want to reach for the nearest bottle and forget. But there we were, in the dimly lit bar, drowning in his sorrow. I found myself empathizing, which was unusual for me. It wasn't my place to get involved in passengers' personal dramas, but there was something about Sebastian that made it hard not to. The empathy turned to curiosity as he spoke about his plans to make things right, to find redemption in the most bizarre of ways. Redemption, in his case, seemed to come in the form of an unusually potent cocktail he wanted to concoct, one that he promised would both heal and obliterate. He smiled at me, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Let me make you a drink. Something special. You deserve it." I hesitated. There was something off about his invitation, but my judgment was blurred by the haze of sympathy and an odd sense of duty to share his burden. I nodded, and he went to work behind the bar, mixing and pouring with a kind of methodical precision. The drink he handed me was deep crimson, with a frothy head that shimmered under the bar's dim lights. He looked at me with a hopeful expectation. I took a sip. The taste was surprisingly smooth, with hints of something I couldn't quite place, maybe bitterness mixed with a kind of sweetness that made it oddly compelling. I felt a wave of drowsiness almost immediately, but I attributed it to exhaustion. The night had been long, the stories heavier. Before I knew it, my vision blurred. I leaned against the bar, feeling as if I were sinking into a deep, dark pool. My mind began to slip away, unable to cling to anything solid. The last thing I remember was Sebastian's face hovering above me, his eyes glinting in the bar's low light. Then everything went black. When I came to, it was as if I had awoken from a deep, unnatural sleep. I was alone in the bar, the soft hum of the ship's engines my only company. The clock on the wall told me hours had passed. The drink had knocked me out for what felt like an eternity. I stumbled to my feet, feeling disoriented and unsteady. Sebastian was nowhere to be found. I tried to shake off the lingering fog in my mind and began searching the bar and the nearby rooms. It was then I noticed something chilling. The crimson cocktail glass lay shattered on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the tiles. A smear of the same deep red color trailed towards the crew quarters. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that something was terribly wrong. Sebastian had vanished, leaving nothing but a sense of dread and a mystery wrapped in the dark red liquid of that final drink. I never saw him again, nor did anyone else. It was as if he had evaporated into the night. The authorities were no help. They found nothing, no clues, no leads. The only thing that remained was the lingering feeling of unease, the sense that I had been part of something much darker than a simple tale of woe and redemption. As I sit here now, recounting this tale, I can't help but wonder if that drink was meant to silence me, to ensure I'd never speak of what I'd seen. Perhaps I was just another character in Sebastian's tragic play, a play where the final act is always shrouded in darkness. Growing up in the secluded stretches of rural Michigan, the world outside my parents' property seemed like a distant, almost mythical place. The silence here was so profound it had a texture thick, almost tangible, like an old wool blanket. On those rare occasions when a sound pierced the stillness, it didn't just disrupt the quiet, it carved into it, leaving an echo that lingered long after the noise had faded. That was the sort of night it was supposed to be still and peaceful. But as I was about to find out, silence can be deceiving. I was 15 and home alone, a regular occurrence when my parents decided to visit the city for the weekend. The house was nestled far from any neighbors, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to absorb every stray beam of moonlight. It was the kind of setting where every creak of the house seemed amplified, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. It started with a bang. A sharp, jarring noise that cut through the silence like a knife. I shot up from my bed, heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears. I grabbed the rifle my father kept in the closet just in case and crept down the stairs. The noise had come from the direction of the old storage building, a ramshackle structure at the edge of our property, used for nothing more than old farm tools and memories of a bygone era. The storage building was barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in, its shadow dark against the creeping mist. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness in erratic patterns. The door was ajar, swaying slightly with the gusts of wind. My breath misted in the cold night air, and every step felt like an echo in the void. I called my father's cell phone, my voice trembling despite my attempts to sound steady. No answer. I dialed 911 next, my heart thudding so loudly I half expected the operator to hear it. They assured me help was on the way, but the calm in their voice only seemed to heighten the dread clawing at my insides. The dispatcher's assurances felt distant and hollow, like echoes in a vast cavern. I peered into the storage building, the flashlight revealing nothing but dusty old furniture and cobwebs. Everything seemed in place, but the uneasy feeling that something was terribly wrong clung to me like a second skin. I moved carefully through the clutter, every creak of the old wooden floorboards magnified in the oppressive silence. I was just about to turn back when I heard a low, guttural noise from somewhere within the building, the kind of sound that could only be described as a growl or a snarl. My skin prickled with fear. I raised the rifle, my hand shaking as I scanned the dim interior. The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling quiet that seemed to seep into my bones. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. I was about to retreat when I saw a figure, barely discernible, shifting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, gaunt, and dressed in dark, tattered clothes that blended into the night. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, and I could feel the malevolence radiating from it. Adrenaline surged through me. I bolted from the building, my heart pounding with every footstep. The phone call with 911 was a blur of frantic words and racing thoughts. I sprinted toward the house, glancing back only once to see the figure emerging from the darkness, following me with an eerie, deliberate pace. I didn't waste time. I threw the rifle into the back seat of my car and tore down the driveway toward my uncle's house, a few miles away, but feeling like a lifetime. The familiar sight of his home, bathed in the warm light of a single porch lamp, was a beacon in the oppressive darkness. I skidded to a halt, slamming the car door behind me and rushing inside. My uncle, his face a mixture of concern and confusion, took one look at me and immediately knew something was wrong. I told him everything, my voice trembling as I relayed the events of the night. He listened, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No sign of intrusion, no strange figures, just the same old barn that had stood empty for decades. They assured me that it was probably just an animal, perhaps a stray dog or a deer. But I knew what I had seen, and the unease never fully left me. The memory of that night has lingered in my mind like a shadow, refusing to dissipate. Sometimes, when the silence is particularly thick, I can almost hear that growl again, feel the chill of those dark eyes watching me from the shadows. The barn still stands, a silent sentinel at the edge of the property, and though I seldom visit it, I can't escape the feeling that something that shouldn't be there is still watching, waiting in the darkness. I'll never forget that night. The kind of night that sticks with you like a stubborn stain, haunting every corner of your mind. I was home alone, an ordinary evening that started with a trip to the gas station and ended with my life spiraling into a horror story. It was late around 11, maybe 12. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that nips at your skin and makes the stars seem sharper, more insidious. I needed gas, so I drove down to the local station, a rundown place that had seen better days. Its flickering lights cast a sickly glow on the cracked pavement, the sort of place you visit only when you have no other choice. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed a man lingering near the vending machines. He was tall, scruffy, with a face that looked like it had been through the ringer. His eyes, though, were what unsettled me the most. They were cold, unblinking, and they followed me as I moved about. I brushed it off as paranoia after all. The night has a way of distorting reality, doesn't it? The man seemed to drift closer as I filled my tank, his gaze never wavering. I paid at the pump, trying to ignore the prickle on the back of my neck. Just as I was about to get back into my car, he approached. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly, like someone scraping a rock across asphalt. I shook my head. "No, I'm fine." I saw the flash of disappointment, or was it malice, in his eyes as he backed off, retreating to the shadows. I didn't think much of it at the time. I drove home, hoping to put the encounter behind me, but as I turned onto my street, my unease returned. The street lights seemed dimmer, the shadows longer, as if the night itself was conspiring against me. I parked my car, went inside, and locked the door behind me. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, the phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife. I answered, only to hear nothing but the whisper of wind and the faint rustle of leaves. I hung up, thinking it was a wrong number or a prank. The calls came again, each one more insistent, each one with the same eerie, empty breath. My skin crawled as I realized the calls were coming from somewhere outside, somewhere in the woods behind my house. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But paranoia has a way of feeding on itself. The phone rang once more, and this time I heard something different, a faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked out the back window, but saw nothing. I was about to return inside when I noticed something, a shadow moving near my car. My heart pounded as I saw the man from the gas station creeping closer. I froze, my mind racing with fear and confusion. He tried the car door, the metal creaking in protest. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to act fast. I darted out the front door and jumped into my car, speeding away with my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my friend's house, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I burst into their home, my nerves raw and frayed. I explained everything about the man at the gas station, the phone calls, and the terrifying encounter. My friend listened with a worried expression before calling the police. The authorities arrived, took my statement, and went to check out my place, but by then, the man was long gone. The police never found him. The unsettling feeling of being watched never fully left me. Every shadow, every rustle of the leaves seemed to whisper his presence. I couldn't shake the image of his cold, unfeeling eyes, nor the chilling sound of his footsteps scraping against the metal of my car. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety and fear. I couldn't stay alone, couldn't be in the dark without my mind wandering back to that night. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, convinced that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Even now, years later, when the phone rings late at night or I hear a scratching sound outside, I'm transported back to that fear. The image of the man, the phantom caller, lingers like a scar on my psyche. It serves as a dark reminder that sometimes nightmares aren't confined to sleep but can be very real, lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary life. The warehouse loomed like a silent sentinel in the dead of night, its shadowy bulk barely illuminated by the dim, flickering streetlights that lined the road. I pulled up to the entrance, the tires of my delivery truck crunching over the gravel like bones breaking underfoot. The place looked abandoned, or at least that's what I hoped. But I was here, just another cog in the machinery of late-night deliveries, tasked with dropping off a shipment that, frankly, I was beginning to wish I hadn't accepted. The silence inside was suffocating. It was as if the building had been drained of all life and sound, leaving only the heavy weight of an unnerving quiet. I glanced around, my flashlight cutting through the gloom in jagged slices. It felt like the darkness was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. My breath came out in visible puffs, mingling with the cold air that seemed to seep from the very walls. Then it happened, a phone began to ring. The sound echoed down the narrow corridor, stark and out of place in the stillness. My first instinct was to follow the noise, to see who or what might be calling in the middle of nowhere at this ungodly hour. But as I took a step forward, the ringing stopped abruptly. A chill ran down my spine, and I hesitated, my fingers gripping the delivery receipt a little tighter. Just then, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, he was nothing more than a moving shadow, but as he drew closer, I could make out his bulk. He was a large man, his presence so imposing it seemed to swallow the light around him. He walked with a deliberate, almost predatory silence, his steps barely making a sound against the cold concrete. My gut told me something was very wrong. I couldn't explain why, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out. So I did the only sensible thing, abandoned the delivery and bolted back to my truck, the engine roaring to life like a beast finally unleashed. I sped away from the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped animal. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. When I finally made it to my small apartment, I was still shaking, trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But the ringing phone never answered haunted me, its ghostly echo lingering in the recesses of my mind. The next morning, I received a call that would shatter my fragile sense of normalcy. It was the police. They were calling to inform me that the delivery I had made, if you could even call it that, was a complete fabrication. No one had ordered anything. The intruder, the large man I had seen, hadn't taken any food. According to the officers, he hadn't even seemed interested in the delivery. Their words twisted in my mind. The whole thing felt like a setup, but for what? What could someone possibly want in an abandoned warehouse in the dead of night? The police suggested that the man had been searching for something other than the food I had been carrying. But what could that be? My mind raced through possibilities, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. The warehouse had felt alive, almost sentient in its silence. The phone call had been a cruel, eerie prank, or maybe a lure. The man hadn't come for the delivery, he'd come for something far more sinister. I never went back to that warehouse, never tried to find out what the man had been searching for. Some things are better left in the dark, buried beneath layers of silence and shadows. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faintest echo of that phone ringing, a haunting reminder of the warehouse and the man who slipped through the cracks of reality. The echo of that night never truly fades. It lingers like the last note of a chilling melody that refuses to be forgotten, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the darkest corners of that forsaken place, the search is still ongoing,